Okay. Hi, everyone. First off, thank you so much for joining this session. I hope all of you take away something from this. Before I begin, there are a few disclaimers that I need to give. The first one is that um, what I intend to do with this session is just to give you a starting point on what preps should be. But I highly encourage everybody to find their own way of prepping because I really think that prep time depends a lot on you, what you prioritize, how you debate, and what your dynamic with your specific partner for that debate, partner/partners for that debate would be. Therefore, please try and find your own strategies and only take this as a foundation in terms of how to prep and what to do during prep time. Secondly, a lot of this material is not something that I've come up on my own. It is stuff that I've taken from YouTube and other debaters and the way they prep, etc. So in case anybody wants any more resources, please feel free to drop me a text and I'll be really happy to send you links for those as well. Okay, what are we going to do in this session then? I'm going to first tell you about what you should be doing during prep time. Second, I'm going to tell you what each person in the team should be doing during prep time. So depending upon your speaker role, what you should be doing. Thirdly, I will try and do some mock preps with you guys just to see if we can do that as well. If Kevin's free, then I'll ask him to join as well. Okay, cool. With respect to questions, I will take questions in the end. Most definitely, I'll leave some time, but the problem is usually I just forget. If you think that your question pertains to something that I'm talking about at the moment, please feel free to just unmute yourself, not unmute yourself, rather just put it in chat that you have a question or type out the question itself in chat and I'll answer it then and there. I would prefer it that way just so that, while we're at that specific thing, if the query gets answered, it's better than just going back to it from the end, etc. And that comes with a bit of confusion. Okay, cool. Let's start then. Okay, also, last thing. So this entire talk is a mixture of BP and AP as well. Like I haven't split it up into two. A lot of these things are quite similar, but I will perhaps tell you a little bit about time breakup and how much time you should be allocating for what thing. Bear in mind, none of this is set in stone. None of this is very rigid or anything like that. I don't follow it most of the time because it just depends from motion to motion, the sort of what do you say, your comfort level with the motion or the round that you're in or who your opponents are or who your partner is and things like that, right? But I do think that it just helps in terms of knowing where to begin. Okay, cool. With that, what do you do first when you enter prep time, right? And I think this is where most people go wrong. You do not think of arguments when you enter prep time. Always remember, you'd never think straight away of arguments that you're going to run on your side. The first thing that you always have to do is think about why this debate exists and what did the CA team perhaps have in mind while setting this motion. So you have to think about what is it that you have to prove in order to win, and what are the things that you have to do one after the other in order to sort of prove that entire claim that you're supposed to be proving. So there are a few things that you need to do during the first 2 minutes or so of prep time, okay? And I think this is extremely crucial because this is where most people go wrong. They panic in the first 2 minutes and then they're just like, oh, I can't think of any arguments. Why they're just not striking me in the first minute, right? That is not how it works. No argument is going to strike you in the first minute. Arguments is something that will come at a very, very later stage of your prep. You first need to understand why is it that you're debating, what is it that you're debating, right? So you brainstorm first. You think about the burdens that you have to prove. What do you have to prove in order to win? You then think about your path to victory, right? And I think this is super, super important. Your path to victory basically means what are the things logically one by one that you have to prove to win that debate, right? So perhaps it's an actor motion, and you have to think about who the actor is, what kind of relationship do they have with the motion, how are they going to react to that motion. After they react, how is perhaps society going to react to them in that way? Is that beneficial or not to them? And then perhaps any ancillary and perhaps any sort of ancillary benefits that it's going to have. Now, you don't have to think what each of these things are. You just have to think of these things in the first 2 or 3 minutes, right? So that's your path to victory. Okay. The next thing that you have to do then is discuss the entire debate with your teammates and flesh out arguments. I think this is the part where you really get into the meat of the debate and discuss various arguments, discuss the kind of mechanisms that you have to prove, etc. Now, at this stage, I think different people have different ways of doing this, right? I think some people don't go into they don't really go that deep into the mechanization or analysis of arguments. So you'll obviously discuss your arguments. What this is what is going to happen, why is going to happen, etc., etc. But sometimes people don't really think about and like they don't discuss. Not that they don't think about it, they don't discuss the analysis or mechanization bit of it. And some people discuss it with their partner. Personally, I discuss everything with my partners. We usually discuss every sort of mechanization that we're going to run, all the analysis that we have to give, etc., etc. So we think of all the arguments, and then we move on. A little bit with respect to characterization and modeling, right? Because I think that usually if you're in the front half of the debate or if you're in an AP, how do you prep these aspects? When do you prep them? Things like that. So personally, what I do is for models especially, I first discuss whether or not we need to have a model or do we have to provide a model in the first place. If we decide that there is a model, like a model is required, for those who don't know what a model is essentially you telling the entire house that this is the way that we're going to proceed with this motion. So for instance, if it's a policy motion, you say that, okay, the way we're going to do it is perhaps we're going to have an independent board of directors who are going to be elected by XYZ people and things like that, right? So model is just your sort of, I would say, precursor. Those are things that you don't have to debate per se, but those are things that need to be done in order for that policy to be effective in the first place, okay? So basically, first we discuss whether or not a model is even required. They're usually required in policy motions. So things like, I can't think of one at the top of my head, but basically whether or not, say for instance, you want to introduce a policy about women or a policy about, I don't know, pharmaceuticals, something like that. Once you've decided whether we want a model or not, we keep that aside. I know that models usually come in the beginning of your speech. Usually the structure of your speech should be characterization, model, and then arguments. But I prefer prepping the model in prep time at the end of my prep time. Because only after you have actually understood and discussed what your arguments should be, can you decide what can be a fair model. So models to be prepped at the end of your prep time. What about characterization then? So after you've discussed your first 2-3 minutes of the brainstorming session that you're going to have, usually you discuss a bit of characterization, right? The things that you have to lay down in order to win. So for instance, if it's a debate about, let's say, women, right? Usually these kind of motions warrant characterization. What is the status of women in the world, the context that you're talking about, whether you're talking about it, whether this debate is placed set in a developed country, whether it's placed set in a developing country, what does that scenario look like, what is the relationship of women, etc., right? So characterization, usually you should prep before going to the arguments, and it's something that you will naturally be able to decide. But what I do is I usually keep an open mind with characterization. Uh, I'd like to go back to it again and again, because once you keep deciding the arguments, you usually realize that, oh, this is something that I should add to my characterization in order for this argument to be more effective, right? So usually with these things that you would normally say at the beginning of your speeches, keep an open mind about while you're prepping, and keep going back to them again and again when you're discussing arguments, to see whether or not you can add something in order to make your argument stronger. Okay, so that is what it is. After you're done this entire thing, usually what I like to do is take about a minute if you're the first speaker, or 2 minutes actually. I usually would prefer taking 2 minutes, but it usually doesn't happen. First speaker, always take a step back and reorganize your notes every single time. If you try and go into giving a speech without having really read through what you've written or restructured it or gone over it, it's not going to flow as naturally. Because what happens in prep time is you're throwing around a lot of ideas, you're throwing around a lot of arguments, you're discussing the merits and demerits of them, but you don't understand where they fit in and what should be a good flow for them, right? Because obviously, at least I'm not a very gifted debater that I can just think in a flow and that's going to be the end of it and that's my perfect debate speech. In 90% of the cases, I have to restructure my notes at least twice in order to make sure that they're logically flowing. So first speakers, please just take a minute and reorganize everything that you're doing. Okay, cool. Do we have any questions so far? No questions. Okay, great. So I have a checklist over here, okay? Like a prep checklist. A lot of people use checklists. I personally have never, not because I didn't find it useful, I was just lazy. What I'm going to do is quickly discuss that checklist with you. Would highly recommend noting it down, because I definitely think it's a very good structured way to go about your preps. I just never did it because by the time I came to know of it, I already had like an entire way of prepping. So I just didn't find enough time to like feed it in. Sometimes I tried to like look at it, but you guys, if you guys should definitely make an effort to incorporate it. I know people who use checklists and it works out amazingly well for them. They're very good debaters. Okay, let's start with the checklist then. The first one is, why is this motion and why was it given? Like I discussed with you earlier. After I discuss it, I'll also put this in chat, okay? So in case anybody wants to copy paste it, you can do that as well. Second, so usually at this stage, people just like complain about the motion. But yeah, if that's your thing, do it. Okay, second is, what is the change that you're bringing about with this debate? And how can you make this change most effectively? This is when you think of a model. Bear in mind that this checklist, you need not follow the order of this checklist, and you can definitely add and subtract things as you want to, right? You can be quite flexible with it depending on what suits you the most. Third is, what is the trade-off for this debate? In the sense that obviously it's a debate, so there's no one side which is going to be absolutely good or absolutely better than the other. It exists in a comparative. So it's basically so you're definitely giving up something in order to achieve something, right? So what you're giving up is known as a trade-off. Now, why is that trade-off worth it? Or how can you effectively minimize that trade-off? Or just show to the other team that what we're trading off is a lot better than what you're trying to trade off. That's how you win debates. So a trade-off is definitely something that you must think about. And I think, especially in a debate, knowing your weaknesses and knowing what your side is going to be hit upon the most and what is the weakest point for your particular side really, really helps. And that is something you will only arrive at when you think of what the trade off is. What is it that you're giving up in order to achieve what you're achieving? Okay. The next thing is the burdens or the things that you have to do to win this debate, which is something that I already discussed about. Then is, do you have a principled argument? So when I first heard this checklist, uh, the debater who was talking about it basically said that in most instances there will be a principled argument, and I completely agree. But I personally believe that you don't need to make a principled argument every time, especially if you are not able to flesh it out really well. I think that principled arguments are really good and really effective, but also really difficult to make. So, although there will most definitely, like in 99% of the cases, there will exist a principled argument, and I would highly encourage everybody to watch a few videos on how to make principled arguments and try and incorporate them in your speeches. Don't only stick to principled arguments. Okay, so if you think of one, great, note it down, but move on. Fine. And I'm saying this because I've seen a lot of people, especially in the Indian circuit, just throw around the word principled argument. Like they think that the moment they see it, something great's going to happen and they're going to automatically win the debate. That's most definitely not the case. In fact, principled arguments are really hard to make. And in most cases, I think consequential arguments win debates, especially when, considering that principled arguments are a little difficult to make. Okay, cool. The next one is, do you have non-principled arguments? That is, do you have arguments which have a more consequentialist sort of impact? Once you think of these arguments, you say whether or not these arguments have been impacted sufficiently. Have you shown the impact of these on perhaps various stakeholders? If it's an actor motion, on the individual itself, if it's from the perspective of society, if it's from the perspective of various groups like minorities, etc., in what way have they been impacted? Perhaps look at it from a spatial perspective as well, in terms of whether it's a long-term consequence, whether it's a short-term consequence, can it be defeated at any point, etc., etc. The next thing is, did you explain which actor acts in what way? And did you link it to your motion and how that actor is better off in your world? This is basically characterization as well. A little bit of characterization, a little bit of like argumentation as well. Did we flesh out arguments well enough? That is your analysis. Please make sure that you write down analysis. A lot of people do not write down analysis. And I think that can be really hard for you, because there are, like, in most instances, like I know people who don't need to write down analysis. For instance, like Kevin does not need to write down like things, like he doesn't write a lot of things in detail because he just remembers them really well. But in most instances, if for somebody like me who just cannot remember things, please write down every single word, especially analysis. Because what tends to happen is during prep, while you're discussing, you're just like, this is so obvious. I'll obviously think of this on the spot. This is like, I'll do it. I know like the general idea of the argument. I'll be able to analyze it. No, bad strategy. You will not remember it. And even if you do, you will not be able to explain it in the depth that you're supposed to. So write down that you're writing mechanization. Another advantage of writing down analysis is that you'll always be able to spot loopholes when you're writing it down. You'll be able to spot where you're lacking, what aspect is lacking, etc., which you won't be able to do if you haven't written it down, right? Okay, next thing is, did you paint a picture for the judges? So this is just you trying to be fancy. And I think this comes at a little bit of a later stage, in the sense that, are you using intuitive examples? Are you using some sort of intuition pumps? Are you giving, like, putting a nice fancy characterization with good rhetoric and stuff? This is something that I have never employed. I am not a fancy speaker. I don't use rhetoric. I don't use fancy words, and I don't use fancy examples. So if you can do it, great. I think it goes a long way, but I also definitely think that it must be restricted to just like the characterization part of your speech, or just a very few select aspects, when you're talking about emotions or something like that. Um, Please don't forget your actual analysis. Like, don't trade it off for rhetoric and fancy language, etc. If it works for you and if you can do it naturally, please go for it. But I definitely think that this is something that you don't have to specifically put an effort into. I think there are other things that you should put an effort into, which warrant more of your time and dedication. The next thing is comparison. Did you compare your world to theirs? So quickly during prep, just think about, at the end of the day, what are the two worlds going to look like? It just helps for you to break deadlocks, or for you to be able to perhaps cement your arguments in a way which can just preempt a lot of the stuff that's coming. A lot of this later part is something that's hard to do during prep. I completely agree, because it's difficult to envision entire debates in just those 15 minutes. It is something that I can't do very effectively either. So don't beat yourself up for it if you can't do all of these things. My advice would be to just start with one thing at a time, just pick up one thing and decide to do that well first, and then incorporate another, and then incorporate another. Don't try and do all of these things together. It'll never happen. Trust me. Okay. The next thing is preempting what the other side will say. So just a brief, like a general sort of discussion, quick thing on what are they going to say, or what's going to be their strongest argument, possibly, things like that. Do you possibly need to make any sort of concessions at all? Agree to something? Are there any things that you might have to agree with them? Something like that, okay? Okay, and the last thing you have to talk about is, do you have your priorities right? In the sense that, have you prioritized the strongest arguments that you can possibly make? Are you making sure that you are targeting the most vulnerable groups, perhaps, that you can ever target? On a lot of philosophy, emotions, or something, have you talked about the most important aspects of life, or the most common aspects of life that individuals can have, in order to make, in order for impacts to affect a more number of people? So the way you usually compare arguments is to see if they affect the most number of people, they affect the most vulnerable groups, etc., etc. So this is just to see whether you have done that, right? So that is the checklist. I'll send it across something in a bit. But do we have any questions so far about the checklist? An effective note making strategy.
I have a question. So sometimes what happens is, when you're following a checklist, you tend to get into other arguments while you are following this. So you may be on number 6 and you come up with something else. So is it better to organically let yourself flow and welcome those arguments, or should you go back to the checklist and stick to it?
So I'll tell you what personally works for me, and it is to always be organic. And I think this specifically is my personal outlook, because I was never formally taught debating. And because I was never formally taught, I just came up with my own methods and strategies and went with what worked for me the most. But my advice would be, even if you are formally trained, always be organic, 100%. Because like I said, these are not things that you have to follow. I don't follow a checklist. I never followed a checklist, but things worked out for me, right? So just do what you think is right. It's okay. Like, I think the most important advice that I can give in terms of debate is just to be really flexible and give yourself the time to come up with things that work for you personally. If you think of stronger arguments, do it. Go for it. Okay, I had some questions in the chat as well. Effective note making strategy. Do you revise these rules beforehand? Any tips on weighing? Okay, let's go one by one. Effective note making. Everybody has everybody has different ways of making notes. I'll just tell you what I do. So because I'm a first speaker, and this is something actually, what is the second question? Do you divide these roles beforehand? Principled argument. Okay, I will tell you. Okay, actually, Jonah's first two questions bring me to the next part. So I'll just address those with that. Any tips on weighing? Okay, so weighing. The way you weigh is to look at a few things. I can think of two at the top of my head. First is if your impacts impact a large number of people. If you're impacting a large number of people, you are winning that argument. Secondly, are you impacting more vulnerable groups? There's a third one as well, which I have forgotten. I think it was about the depth of argument or something. I will get back to you on that. But I think that weighing is something that if we do a session on speaker roles and then whipping, I think Kevin will perhaps be able to explain, or anybody else, not just him, will be able to explain better. What's a principled argument? Okay, a principled argument is basically one without consequences, okay? So it is something that's so crucial that you can't really do without it. Let's take an example of a principled argument. Wait, let me just look one up quickly. If you want to watch a video on principles, there is one called Super Shiny Principles by Ashish Kumar, which is like the OG principles debate video that everybody will recommend to you in the whole world. So you can go ahead and watch that as well. I think it's super, super, super interesting. Okay, let me give you an example. Okay. Let's take this example, right? Why do you value something like voting? Why does universal adult franchise exist in the world? Why is it so important to give every single person a vote? A lot of these things you can't really solve by consequentialist arguments, right? What impact do you give of this? What argument could you possibly make that could give an impact? So the way you sort of argue this out is to talk about the principle of autonomy, right? Or the principle of human dignity. The reason why every single person gets a vote, or even any fundamental right? Why do you bestow fundamental rights upon individuals? What have they done? Why do they deserve it? You have no answers for things like that, right? But you can argue that by way of principled arguments. Talk about the importance of autonomy. What makes any individual human or capable or worthy of living is the idea that they have the autonomous right to make their own decisions, or they have the autonomy to exist. That is the most fundamental tenet or facet of life, which in fact even makes you human, or in fact just gives you the ability to be human, and that you are not an alien or a machine or something else, right? If autonomy were to not exist, then you as a human being, you wouldn't be a human being. And because you have autonomy as an individual, that is why you have the right to vote. Because voting is the only way that your autonomy can be preserved. So in a situation where you are under the stronghold of a state that can wield any amount of power that it possibly wants upon you, the only way that any individual can even sustainably be human is only and only if they have autonomy. So voting or fundamental rights are one way to preserve that autonomy. Otherwise, it is unjustified for a state to wield that much amount of power on you. Okay, so that's a principal document. There are no consequences involved in this. It's just a pure sort of explanation on the core tenets of why something the way it is. Okay. Also, principled argumentation are an entirely different conversation in themselves. Go check the video out. If we have the time, we'll post another session on those as well. Although I'm bad at principles, so. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to now go on to the next part, which is going to hopefully answer Jonah's questions as well, with respect to note making and division of roles, etc. Let me see, where are my notes? Okay, cool. So let's go the Asian style, the 3 versus 3 format. So I think in that when you have 3 people, usually one person is the one who's guiding prep, okay? So they're the ones who are just throwing around arguments, brainstorming, things like that, right? The other individual is the one who's taking notes. This is usually the first speaker. And this is something I personally do as well. During prep, because I'm always the first speaker, I'm always taking notes and writing everything down, simply because I have to speak first. And writing things down also shows a lot of gaps that you might have in your argumentation and that you might possibly want to fill. The third person is usually the devil's advocate, who questions things and makes sure that you're answering crucial things and there are no loopholes, etc. in your arguments. This is the 3 versus 3 format. The PP format is the first speaker usually doing the role of 2 people. So playing the devil's advocate as well as taking notes. So this is just how personally I work, okay? I'm sure other people have other ways of doing it. I'm sure other people just discuss everything together. But the way I do it is usually, since I'm first speaker, I'm usually taking down notes and questioning and pointing out loopholes or things that we possibly might have missed. Or a lot of times what happens is when you write down arguments, you realize, oh, wait, I have to prove something before this in order for this argument to make sense. So it serves a dual purpose. You're able to point out gaps as well, and you have your notes, so you're ready to go. Or you don't have to take time differently in order to write your notes, etc., etc. So that is in speaker roles. On effective note making, I'll tell you what I personally do. I know different people have very, very different styles of taking notes. I've seen people, some people usually divide their one sheet into 4 parts in a PP, and then they'll write tiny things with colored pens, like just 1 lines, of main argumentation. I've seen people draw flow charts and mind maps and arrows and things like that. So whatever works for you. But what I do is I have very, very extensive notes. I use 1 A4 size sheet usually for making my personal notes that I'm going to say. Have another A4 size sheet to write down arguments and rebuttals of other teams. So the one that I'm writing my main notes on, what I do is that I usually have space for different arguments, right? So I won't usually I don't run more than 3 arguments, max. But the way I do it is first I write characterization, and I write down whatever my lines of characterization are. But my trick is that I always leave some space after every argument or characterization, in case I have to go back and add something. So characterization, and then I'll write some things down. Then I'll leave some space. Then I'll write argument, I'll write the serial number 1. And I have different ways of writing my serial numbers as well, right? So for my main argument, I'll put a circle after my 1. And if it's a sub argument, I'll put a dot after my 1, 2, 3, like that. Okay, so that's the way I do it. So I can distinguish whether it's a main argument or if it's a subpart of an argument or something like that, right? And usually the way I personally start my speeches is to say, okay, there are 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. So when I have those like 1, 2, 3 circled, I know that, yeah, okay, I have like 3 other number of arguments that I have, right? So then so if I've written like number 1 and put a circle around it, that's a main argument. I'll write the header for that argument. Usually leave a little bit of space in case I want to change the name of the argument, call it something else. Write my argument down. Sometimes I like to make arrows as well. So it depends, right? So if it's an explanatory sort of argument, then I will not make arrows. I'll just write like, I'll put like a bullet point and then I write one thing and then put another bullet point and write. But if it's a more mechanisms, like, one thing leads to the other kind of thing, then I'll put like downward arrows like that. And then I'll go one after the other, niche, aise karke. So that's the way I personally do it. And then, of course, after I finish my first argument, I'll leave a little bit of space and then move on to my next one, because I know that I'll probably go back and write something in it. I probably might have to delete something in case I think it's not important, or reword it or something like that. So that is how I personally like to do. I also use colored pens, like not a lot, just 2 different colors to write my rebuttals, just to differentiate my rebuttals from my main points. I have a separate sheet in which I write the arguments of the other teams. Usually I fold it in half and then have govern op like that. So I'll write something down and I have to write a rebuttal, it'll be in another colored pen. So basically that. But what I would suggest, highly recommend rather, is to always number your arguments. It helps in a few ways. Usually, sometimes when I'm in my other sheet, when I'm writing rebuttals, etc., I also correlate my argument number to them. So if I have to integrate my rebuttals, it becomes a lot easier, right? So I know that, okay, this rebuttal has to come after this argument, and then it comes integrated, and then it's not like a whole hodgepodge kind of thing, right? So that is something that I do. In case you want to follow the structure, go for it. But I would highly, highly recommend finding a note-making structure that suits you the most. Because I've seen people use varied structures, whatever works and helps them. So that is on note-making. I hope, okay, do you have any questions so far? Okay, no questions. Do I have to say anything else? Oh, yes. Okay. How do you prep closing half then? How do you prep for extensions if you're like a CG or a CO in a BP, right? This is when I think it gets slightly tricky. But because a lot of your extensions usually you just make in your speech, like during the debate is going on. But there are a few things that you should definitely do in prep. First is that you don't have just the 2 minutes to think of what the debate is. You have slightly more time. Take a good 4 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes to really think about what this debate is about and where it's going to end up, most importantly, right? Like at the end of the day, what do you have to prove? Any precautionary tips for digital note making? Okay, I'll get to this. So, essentially, you have to make sure that you're most definitely discussing where this debate is going to end up and what is going to happen in the end, essentially. Right? Once you've done that, don't waste your time on basic arguments. However, please discuss basic arguments. I cannot emphasize on the number of times that I have just run basic arguments from a closing half because my opening half wanted to be too fancy and make sure that they didn't leave arguments for the closing half. And if you haven't discussed the basic arguments, thinking that your opening half will definitely take them, you just unnecessarily like dug your own grave, okay? So make sure that you're not spending too much time, but just like listing, okay, XYZ. So like, like, for example, let's take like rainbow capitalism. Okay, and if it's something about like this house supports pink washing. And this house supports rainbow capitalism. Basic arguments are going to be things like, oh yeah, okay, coverage and reach to other people and things like that, right? And how there's more advertisement and how better awareness, etc., etc. This is something a front half is going to run, but discuss them like that, the way I just said them out loud, to make sure that, once you realize that your front half hasn't made them, you can quickly discuss with your partner. How do you focus on extensions then? Okay, so in the scenario that you assume that the basic arguments are going to be taken by your front half, how do you prep for extensions in prep time? So there are 3 ways that I can see in my notes, at least. I'm sure there are other ways as well. But the first one is to focus on impacting, right? So have they proven enough impacts? Have they proven impacts on all different stakeholders that can be possibly involved? These are things that you should probably think about. Or have they just stopped after a certain point and you think that there can be definitely more impacts or lengthier impacts flowing from this? And I think especially in themes like education, impacting really, really works, because education or even economics and things like that, right? There are so many stakeholders involved. You can show impacts on so many different kinds of people over there. The next thing is concluding, right? So why does this debate end? A lot of times people just leave their mechanisms halfway. They don't fully show what difference or what change do those mechanisms really make. So you can perhaps finish those mechanisms. And the last thing is for you to differentiate, which is mostly in the cases of horizontal extension. No, not a horizontal, a vertical extension rather, where you're just filling in analysis or mechanisms that you think your front half missed. So that is that. But always remember that, especially with closing half, you have to be super flexible, even very, very flexible, because there's a good chance that whatever you discuss will get taken by a first, your opening half, and you have to be really quick on your feet and think and change it completely. But it helps when you've thought about the debate in general beforehand in your first 4 to 5 minutes, right? Okay, I think there's a question. Precautionary tips for digital note making with partner. I have never tried this actually. And do you mean with your partner in the sense that both of you are making notes on the same document?
Yeah.
Is that it? Oh, I have personally never tried this, and I think I have, but it just has never worked for me. So I generally don't have much to say about it. If it's working for you, then that's super great. But I would personally recommend having your own notes. I'm just super picky like that, because I personally have a certain way of making notes. So I'm just मैं अपना करूँगी type, and I write my notes. And guys, I'm a boomer. I don't type it out. I have to write it. I'm not a boomer actually. I'm just super rigid. Okay. I think that's about it. I think I have something about some things that you should definitely be really precautious about. Don't be overconfident about the motion. When you are, you will most always miss key analysis. And I've seen so many debaters do this all the time. They think if they're being intuitive, suddenly their argument becomes super impressive or really great or something. It's not true. Please focus on your analysis. Okay. Another thing why your prep might not go great is when you don't have specific knowledge about motions. And I know this happens a lot, and I know this happens to you no matter what stage of debating you get at. The only way around it is, one, to keep reading as much as you can and note it down. Please don't just read, guys. Please note things down. It really helps. I can't tell you the number of times I've just gone back to my prep file and picked up information from there and made arguments. You will not remember things. But in the event that you haven't shared anything about it, extrapolate. This is the best advice I can give. Just think about I'm sure there must be some kind of logical explanation for this. How do I find that logical explanation? Just don't panic. Okay. Then the reason why your prep might fail is if you have an irrelevant discussion, or if your teammates are talking over one another, or you have an argument-centric discussion and don't think about the debate as a whole. Sometimes you might get the debate wrong. For this aspect, it's fine. Like, getting the debate wrong is just something you can't help. Like, no matter how much you prep or no matter how much you do, like, I think there was one round at WDC where we really tanked. Like, we had no idea what the motion was about. It was something on esports and like something really geeky. And I had just no idea what that was motion about. And we took a good hard fourth. So trust me when I tell you this, it's okay. Like, there'll just be some things that you will just always get wrong. You wouldn't know what it is about. So it's all right. Just treat it as part of the process. How do you avoid this? Play to your strengths. And I think that's a great advice, to be honest. I think people often forget it. When you're doing any activity, you don't have to focus on the odds, especially when you're in it. While you're in a debate, there's no point of thinking about what could go wrong or what have you not done so far. You just have to go with it and play to whatever you know best. Okay. Okay, how do you improve your prep? And I think this is something that you should definitely do, and I've said this before also. The greatest way to improve upon your prep time, especially, is to time yourself with your partner. Give yourself, I would suggest that if you have in a BP, if you have 15 minutes, while you're prepping, give yourself 12 minutes. Prep on a motion on which you have a YouTube video about, and then watch the YouTube video, compare cases. Or you can perhaps give a speech and then compare cases, whatever works for you. Okay, great. So I think I'm done with the boring theoretical bits of this. I'm just going to answer this question. Does anybody have more questions? Oh, I already answered this, sorry. Any questions?
What is the biggest red flag, that a big no-no that you should not do during prep at all?
Should not do during prep. Panic. Never panic. Ever. And take it from somebody who always panics in econ and IR motions. You will find a way, guys. Trust me. And genuinely, I'm telling you this. You will panic during prep, and then you'll go to the debate and you'll just be like, oh my God, this debate is so simple. Or you'll and here's the thing, right? And this is a philosophy that I've been following for a long time. I've been trying to follow for a really long time. I haven't successfully. But if something is hard for you, it's going to be difficult for everybody else, right? So if you're finding it tough, so are all the other teams in your room as well. So just don't panic. Like, don't panic at all. Like, you will most definitely find a way to get around things. And if it's a difficult motion that you think you're coming up with really basic arguments for and you don't know a lot of things about it, the likelihood is everybody's going to come up with very basic arguments because they also wouldn't know a lot of things about the motion. So just don't fret, okay? Because that's going to be worse off for you. And in most cases, trust me, you will enter the debate and you'll just be like, oh my God, everyone's running such basic stuff. I know this, you know? So it's okay. It's definitely something that if you are somebody who does panic, it is something that will take time to overcome. But it is just really important to remember that it can be done. Most definitely can be done. Okay, I think I have some more questions. Should we include the important arguments mentioned by opening half in our web speech? Yes, of course you should. Your job as the whip is to rebut the strongest things that have come from the opening half. So, for example, your CG whip, so your gov whip. So you obviously have to take down the strongest arguments that your OO brought up, and you have to differentiate yourselves from your OG. and say why your arguments are more relevant or more important, or answered more questions in the debate than your opening tips. So yes, you definitely have to address them, rebut them, not state what those arguments are, but take them down and prove to the House why what you said is more important, or why those arguments are irrelevant, they don't work, just not as important, uncomparative, whatever. Okay. Should we spend major time working on first speech's opening? Yes, you should. Most definitely, you should. Your prep should be first speech oriented. What I usually like to do is, after I've restructured everything, I usually run it by my partner quickly and say, this is what I'm going to say. And then usually then, once my partner knows that this is what I'm going to say, they'll usually think of something else to bring in the deputy speeches as well. Okay, more questions? Anything at all, even if it's not prep time oriented, I'll try my best to answer.
How do you think your prep time has changed over the years, and is it something that just comes naturally over time, or you like actively work hard into it?
I think it's a mixture of both. It is working hard on knowing what works for you. If you understand what I'm trying to say, right? It's not going to come organically. Like, I'm going to be honest, debating is not an organic activity. I don't think anybody can just wake up one day and say, I'm going to become the best debater in the world. It's definitely a lot of hard work and patience that goes into it. So you most definitely have to structure your prep time and work around it and see what you have to do in order to improve it. And with respect to how much it has changed, I wouldn't say it has changed as much as it has evolved. There were just a lot of things that I didn't think of before. And here's the thing, right? Prep time depends on a lot of factors. It depends upon, like I said, what the motion is, who your partner is, most importantly, whether you have a consistent partner, whether you have changing partners, what do your partners prioritize, what kind of argumentation style are you comfortable with, what is your speaker role, what kind of topics are you comfortable with, things like that. So for instance, if it's an econ motion, usually my partner takes the lead. If it's something like something else, I'll take the lead. It depends from thing to thing, right? But it has evolved a lot, most definitely. Because a lot of times what happens is that some things initially I had to discuss, like I had to discuss a lot of really basic things in the beginning, but now I don't have to do that anymore. Like we have that frequency where we are just like, okay, yeah, this is the argument we have to run. Then I'm just like, oh yeah, these are things we have to prove in it. And that's something that will come only when you've been debating for a while. Or if it's something that you've consistently worked on. So for some teams, for instance, we have a sort of structure to follow. That is something that we incorporate in prep time as well. So a lot of different things that go into it.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any more questions, guys? Okay, great. I'm just going to wait for another minute if you have any questions. And then you can just stop the recording, guys. And let me see if we have time to do a mock prep.
Like just a last question regarding your partner during case prep. Do you think that it's important that you have a consistent partner that you have a rapport with? And if in case you're like changing partners, is it like difficult to adapt to the different case prep time that we have? How do we navigate through that?
This is really personal, guys. And I'm going to be biased about this because I've had a really consistent debate partner for like since the beginning. So I will definitely say that it helps a lot, because I think you also have to realize that debating isn't just about building cases with your partner, right? It's also about the way you face losses, how people react to them, what are your coping mechanisms, or what you do before a debate, how do you prep for a debate beforehand, what do you do outside of the debate room, and things like that, right? And I think when you know the way your partner reacts to things like that as well, it becomes a lot easier to prep with them. So argumentation, of course, is a whole different thing. But you also have to look at this because it's a sport at the end of the day, right? Would you ask the same question to a football team and expect them to say that no, teamwork doesn't matter? Of course it does. Of course it really, really helps. But I also understand that it's not possible for everybody to have a consistent debate partner. And I've been really lucky on that front because I have. But in the event that you don't have a consistent debate partner, my advice would be to, if you're aiming to do a debate with them, at least do a few debate practices before and do a few rigorous preps with them, because I think it's important to figure out your style of prepping. Like some people really love talking during prep time. I'm somebody who usually stays quiet and asks the questions, right? So whereas somebody else might prefer talking a lot, right? So in order for you, like I remember right when I was in my first year and I did like an AP, and obviously I was doing it with people I hadn't really debated with before. And our first practice was a disaster. We couldn't agree on anything. Nobody knew what was happening. It was an absolute mess. Okay, so my advice would be to please prep rigorously, right? To ease into the roles, to be comfortable around each other, to know what themes certain speakers are really good at. So you would naturally allow them to take the lead if it's a motion on that, or speaker roles, things like that, right? So even if you can't do whole practices, prep a lot.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, another question. How do you go to debate? How do you go about a debate in retrospect? Like after you're done with the debate rounds and knowing. Oh, this is a great question, actually. Like I said, just go over the debate. Not like I said, but basically just go over the mistakes that you did, and try and be as objective about it. I know usually after debate rounds, everybody just thinks that it's unfair that you got a loss. But if you've got a loss, look at the mistakes and see where you went wrong. If you won, also be slightly critical about yourself, what you could have done better, things like that. Like don't be like super analytical and like really just what do you say, like extremely critical, or don't place yourself under too much scrutiny, the point at which you're just unmotivated to debate further. My advice just would be do what you feel like doing at the moment. It's not that I sit after every round and discuss with my partner what went wrong and what we could have done better. Most definitely not. We just do it for rounds that we feel like doing it at, Sometimes you don't do it at all. Like a lot of times you don't do it at all because we're just not in the right frame of mind or something. So that's the first thing I have to say about it. And the second thing would just be to look at the judges' feedback and take it in and try and take it in good faith. So even if you've got a terrible judge who's just randomly like marked you down, just think about the fact that, okay, this is an average judge. I have to sway these kind of judges only. So what do I have to do in order to sway these judges, right? So something like that as well. If it's a motion that you don't know anything about, if it's an IR motion or econ or something like that, usually we make note of the theme and try and read up about it later. So that is also a way that you can retrospect. A lot of times, if you faced a good team, we try and make good extensive notes. Or if it's a good case that we run and we're super proud of, we try and make a note of it and keep it in our matter file. So those are things that you can do in retrospect. And this doesn't have to be just after the round. You can, of course, do it at the end of the day or just later on whenever you feel like, after you've thought about it. If there's ways that you think that you could have run the argument better. Sometimes, okay, fun fact, and this is just really absurd, okay? Every time I lose a debate on a certain theme that I didn't know about, the very next day, I will find an article on it. And I will not like go and Google it. It'll just come my way somehow. It's really absurd and it's really strange, but yeah, any whatever stupid piece of information. My point is that later on, sometimes you just think, ki, I ran this argument, I could have run this better in this way. Maybe you read something about it. Maybe something just clicked to you a few days later. Make sure that you're discussing all of that and make sure you're noting it down. Like I said, it's like a long-term process, Okay. Any more questions? Okay. I see no questions. Then
I have one question. Like I went to an international debate and there was some motion about America, China, something, and they explained one argument. Like the whole speech was based on one argument, and it was like they were coming up with the analysis of the same argument again and again in every different possible way, and the AJ was very convinced of that. How do we, make that? Because we try to make more arguments so that we can sort of elongate our speech, but they were like making one argument, and that was so very well explained that no other argument could stand in front of it.
So is your question, how do you tackle something like that?
How do we make an argument in that way? Like
in that way, in a really well explained manner.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no hack to this, okay, guys? Like, I don't think I can really tell you how do you make really well explained arguments. If I had to go into the whole aspect of how to analyze arguments, I think that is what debate is, right? That's like 60% of debating. And I don't think it can be just told to you in 2 minutes of an answer. But my sort of, I would tell you how I would perceive me to go, how I would start trying to build those kind of arguments. And this is a long-term process. First is, of course, to try and critically analyze them. Second is to read up. Trust me, reading up does not only help you in IR and econ motions, it will help you in almost every single motion. And take my word for it, every single thing you read, it can be anything extremely random. It will help you at some point in the other in debating. I remember that I had given a random judge test months, I don't even know when it was, a long time ago. And I had watched a debate video during that. And I picked up a mechanism. I remembered a mechanism from that debate and used it in my final round of WDC, which basically just made us break. So believe me on this, seemingly unimportant things can become really, really crucial for you. So the first step towards building well-analyzed arguments is to be really aware of what you're reading and noting it down, okay? I think the second thing is just a generic answer that everybody would tell you is to ask yourself the question, why? The different ways of analyzing an argument, and I just think it depends from motion to motion. We can perhaps have a separate discussion on how to analyze, but there's no there's no shortcut to this. You just have to go why. How you could improve is to watch tons of debate videos and make very extensive notes. This is, I think, the best way to improve on debating. Especially when debating has got online, you have videos with really good quality as well. So you can actually make out a lot of arguments and note them down. Always note them down. Usually we have our matter files sorted with theme-wise videos as well. So notes of theme-wise videos. So, and you know what? I have just copy-pasted arguments so many times from debate videos that I've watched. Because we've reached a point where it's hard to come up with extremely novel arguments. So extremely novel motions rather. So you will be able to make sure that, analysis is something that is really hard to come up with on your own. So you just have to find ways of gathering that analysis,
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay. Anything else, guys? Okay, it's all right. I can take questions later on as well. Okay, guys, can we stop the recording?